Recently, I have observed a significant social change happened in exile Tibetan community due to the growing up of the second and the third generations. They have faced problems are different from their parents and grandparents, both economically and politically. How to deal with the situation does not only the personal choices, but also related to the preserving of Tibetan identity and the movement of Tibetan cause. So we have this panel, Tibetan in Exile, Identity and Legal Challenges. We will have 3 papers provide different aspects on discussing this issue. And the first paper title is Legal Mobilization of Tibetan Refugees in India. And our presenter is Degi Children, and she's a PhD candidate from Gandigram Rural Institute. So let's welcome Degi, please.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My paper is something related. It's not exactly my PhD thesis, but something related with what I do right now. It's about the legal mobilization of Tibetan refugees in India. Let me introduce what is the legal mobilization among the Tibetan refugees in India. The first slide, introduction. So why there's a legal mobilization among the third generation Tibetan refugees in India. The paper discuss about the legal mobilization which happens within the third generation Tibetan refugees in India. So one thing is like in the beginning of when Tibetans arrived in India in 1959 and 60s and for the last for the next 2 decades they have been the first generation and second generation have managed to maintain their refugee status, but the third generation they have this aspiration to change their legal status, not just by remaining as a refugee but to claim all the rights which is entitled to them. So the paper discusses about the legal mobilization that happens only in the third generation Tibetan refugees, and to achieve their dreams, to achieve what they wish to do. These are the things that discussed in the paper. Okay. So in this paper, the methodology used are the are interviewed taken from 40 Tibetan refugees living in Bailakuppe, South India. So this is the settlement where I belong, and this is the data collection which I've taken during the COVID pandemic. So it was very easy for me to go around and interview some of the young Tibetan refugees, third generation Tibetan refugees, who through social snowball sampling, snowball sampling, which means they have experienced kind of a discrimination or as a refugee, or those who have faced difficulties with their documentation, all those kind of people, and all those young Tibetan, and they aspire to change their legal status because of their past experiences and past difficulty events or encounters in their life. So I've excluded the participant who are born in 1960s and 70s because they are not eligible eligible to claim citizenship in India, because they do not in the Citizenship Act. Those Tibetan who are born till 1987, those who are born before 1987 are eligible, but those who are born in 1960s and 70s are the second generation, not the third generation. So those who are born between 1980s to 87 are the third generation Tibetan are selected. Excluded group of members are those people who are second generation born in 1960s and 70s. And I've taken some of the secondary sources such as government reports or articles related taken from the internet or through through interaction with government officials. These are the secondary sources which I've taken. This is the methodology that I've used in this paper. So before we discuss about the legal mobilization, we have to know why this legal mobilization is important to discuss about or important to understand, because in the beginning when Tibetan refugees arrived in India, the first and second generation Tibetans, most of them have rejected the citizenship which was given to them, which are entitled to them, thinking that for the first generation Tibetans, when they arrived in India, they thought that it's a short period, it's a temporary stay, and it's a short period of stay, so they might end up going back to Tibet. So that's why they did not claim the citizenship in India. For the second generation, they have ascribed the status of refugee and thought that refugee is the only status that they can claim. But in the case of third generation refugee Tibetan refugees, they have the eligibility to claim for citizenship, and most of them are eligible to take citizenship. So that's why it is very important to understand the process of legal mobilization through the rejection from the first rejection by the first and second generation, and why there is a change, or why there is a shift of citizenship, shift in the idea of citizenship among the Tibetan refugees of third generation. So in the paper also the paper also discuss about the rejection of the citizenship by the first and second generation, and move towards the legal mobilization of third generation Tibetan. So when we talk about the legal mobilization, first we talk about the why there is a legal mobilization among why there's the idea of legal mobilization among the third generation Tibetans. Because for the third generation Tibetan refugees, they find a lot of uh, mm, restriction of policies, or in terms of their personal experiences. So what they do is they try to find the problem. What is the problem? What is the problem that is attached with their legal refugee status? And they gather kind of a relevant information in association with the policies. What are the policies that allow them to do certain things, and that does not allow them to do certain things? And then they find the alternative. In order to find the alternative to remove the discrimination, or to remove the future consequences, and they also make to avoid such consequences in the future, they make a legal choice of becoming Indian citizenship by surrendering the refugee status. So the refugees, those who are born, those who are third generation refugees, they find themselves into a process that allow them to change their legal status, not to remain how their parents or grandparents have maintained their refugee status. So these are the process kind of legal mobilization that happen within the third generation refugees. And this is not just about the legal or political, it's more of a personal experience. It's about the psychological process that they encounter through to to gain all the rights, or to have a certain kind of self kind of self actualization, or to have a certain rights that is and that is entitled to other Indian citizens. So these are the mobilization, not just about the socio-economic, it's more of a personal experience. So the legal mobilization in this paper, what I've encountered, what I've collected the information, the data collection that I have gained from the participants are more, they have shared their expression of legal mobilization into these three categories: the political factors, the instrumental, and the individual choice. So what they think is the political factor is they think that the political factor, which means the policies that gives them the right, either by birth, being a birth, or through descendants. If one of their parents are Indian citizen, they can easily claim the Indian citizenship. Or if they are born between before 1987, they are entitled to have a citizenship, to claim Indian citizen. These are the political factors or the policies factor that have influenced them. The second is the political leaders or the individual who are in power. For example, those individuals who are CTA leaders, who have claimed citizenship of citizen, who are citizen of other countries, but still they work in the work in the CTA. So they take as an example of those political leaders, or those who are in the politics, those individuals who are in power. They take their example and to claim the citizenship. The third Reason is the weak state and nation policy. Some of them find it the policies of refugees are very weak, and they find it that it is better to have to become an Indian citizen rather than staying as a refugee, because the policy, they find certain policies which are very weak to justify their future survival. So the other one, the another factor is the very much maybe everybody knows that it's very instrumental, such as the job opportunities, or for example, if Tibetan refugees would want to work as a chartered accountant or work as a lawyer, so they need to have an Indian citizenship to exercise that right. So that becomes very difficult for refugees to claim those rights, those opportunities, because of their refugee status, and to own a property. Many of them refugee stays, this third generation refugee still stays in refugee settlement. Even if they want to move out and own a property, they are not eligible to do that. And to expand their reach, in the sense to expand their businesses, to have a different career options, not though their majority of their parents are sweater business owners, but the children does not want to have the same sweater business, to work as a seasonal sweater business worker. So they would want to have other career options, or they want to reach somewhere which is very where refugee becomes ineligible to reach. So these are very instrumental, where they think about the opportunities, job opportunities, or owning a property, or to have their own to have a better career options. The other one is the individual choice, the choice of individual, the choice they make it psychologically, the political consciousness of refugee status, the which means that how the refugee status, how the discrimination, or how the differences that shows between the refugee and citizens, the conscious about the social reality that they face. And the other one is insecurity. Definitely the some policies, such as like staying in India with RC, even though the law says you are eligible to extend your renew your RC for 5 years, but in reality, when you go and renew your RC, it's only you will be granted for the renewal only for 1 year. So these kind of insecurities are also there, which is attached with the documents. The status of dignity and application of citizenship law. Definitely, many of them think that I'm eligible to claim the citizenship because I'm entitled to the citizenship law that makes me eligible to become Indian citizen. So these are the individual choice, or the social reality that they face, and they make the individual choice of becoming an Indian citizen, or mobilizing their own legal status by choosing Indian citizen over refugee status. So the paper, though it's a working paper, I have not completed the paper yet, but the paper discusses about the refugee status, or why they are barred from being a complete present in the place. Present complete in the place does not only mean in Indian social system, it means also in the refugee, also in the Tibetan community. For instance, some of refugees feel that they are not in the they don't feel the presence, because they do not have the citizenship right, or neither they have the refugee rights, such as the share given to the refugees. Many of third generation Tibetan does not have that share given to the refugees. They feel that they are neither here or there. So such kind of discussion also happens, also discussed in the paper. A sense of belonging from their passion. So even though many third generation Tibetans are born and brought up in India, in the settlement, much of their sense of belonging is attached with their passion, their emotion attached with the country. So when we discuss about the legal mobilization, what would happen to the Indian Tibetan identity, such kind of discussion gives a sense of they give a sense of response, saying that they would want to have a sense of belonging, because the future is unknown for the refugees. So they feel that a sense of belonging can be felt only by the emotions or the passion to be in India. So the emotions or the feeling attached with the place. and the political influence of other to form a standardized idea of claim. Definitely the political influence of others, for instance, I've mentioned like those who have those individuals who are in power, or those individuals who have moved to Western countries and have claimed a citizenship in the US or anywhere else. So they try to take example of such individuals. Many refugees remains primarily unaware. Definitely many of the first generation, second generation, and most of third generation are completely unaware. Not, I'm not saying completely unaware, but they have a very little knowledge about the policies and the schemes that are entitled to them. So such kind of confusion makes them to take a decision uh, in a very without knowing the complete information. So they take such kind of decision. So legal base, so they find that citizenship is the legal base to exercise all the rights that they have, they are entitled, or they think that if I become an Indian citizen, I can exercise all the right, though it might not be possible for them, but it is the belief that they have in them. So this is, since this is a working paper, so these are the discussions so far I have made it. So that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you for the Gates presentation. And she has mentioned about different factors on how the Tibetan young people has do the legal mobilization for getting citizenship in India. Okay, so now we will move to the second paper. The second paper title is Who is a Pure Tibetan? Identity, Intergenerational History and Trauma in Exile. The presenter is Dawa Dokitsang, who is a PhD candidate from University of Colorado. So Dokitsang, please proceed. Thank you.
Go ahead. So this is a published essay. It came out in 2018. It's under the book titled Tibetan Subjectivities on the Global Stage, Negotiating Dispossession, and I prepared a shorter version for you guys. Who is a pure Tibetan? Who decides? This question is explored in this presentation through an ethnographic illustration of how Tibetans conceptualize being Tibetan. I do this by engaging contemporary discussions on purity between Tibetans online. Purity was needed, argued many, to preserve the Tibetan identity. For Tibetans inside and outside Tibet, preservation was a project that Tibetans collectively began after the Chinese invasion. As the invasion transitioned into a full-scale colonial occupation, Tibetans witnessed a systematic destruction of their culture, a cultural, political, and spiritual heritage. Under such circumstances, many in exile saw purity as an avenue for preserving the Tibetan culture and identity. But what does this purity look like? And what are the consequences when certain members of the Tibetan collective feel they cannot fulfill such notions of Tibetan purity? On March 24, 2014, Voice of America Tibetan posted a segment from their air program titled Mixed Parentage Tibetans in Tibetan Society on its Facebook page. In the segment, Tibetans of mixed heritage living in the West were invited about the challenges and struggles of being racially mixed. The post on Facebook quickly generated discussions in its comment section by Tibetans on the subject of mixing, whether linguistically, culturally, or genetically. A commenter named Tenzin had this to say. While Tenzin's views are not representative of all exiled Tibetans, they reflect the sentiments of Tibetans who are against mixing. Tenzin bases the purity of Tibetanness in terms of race. Pure Tibetans did not racially mix. Instead, Tenzin cites racial mixing as promoting a hindrance for Tibetan unity. While some commentators cited cultural degradation as a reason to avoid genetic mixing, others recognized existing populations of mixed Tibetans, arguing that such comments were promoting disharmony and discrimination amongst Tibetans. The discussion generated so much heat that the site administrators began deleting comments that were deemed too inflammatory. Following this post, Tibetan friends of both mixed and non-mixed backgrounds expressed in private how racist they thought some of these views were. Sonam, an activist who is of mixed Tibetan heritage, told me how she was not surprised by some of these purist comments. For Sonam, this was nothing new. She explained that similar comments were made to her throughout her childhood by other Tibetans. Surprised, I asked how she handles her grassroots political activism work, which requires her to work alongside Tibetans who hold purist views. Sonam said that she no longer entertains such comments, that she was over it because she knows who she is. In a short film that Pema Yoko made in 2007 called British Tibetan, she shares intimate thoughts and frustrations on her relationship with her Tibetan father and their opinions regarding Pema's Tibetan identity. In the video, they have the following dialogue. Near the end of Pema's monologue, she says, "Come on, Dad. I mean, you married a Japanese woman, yeah? And you married in London and had me here. So, like, what did you think I would be?" A frustrated response to her Tibetan father's unrealistic, pure Tibetan expectations. In the same sentence, Pema makes it known that she grew up in London with hardly any Tibetans. Yet, she tried her best to be a part of Tibet, of the Tibetan community, in things that he wanted her to be. Despite such efforts, she says, nothing's ever good enough for you, or you just don't appreciate it about her father, and concludes with, "Cut me some slack, man, please." In Pema's father's response, he clarifies that his frustrations with Pema's lack of spoken Tibetan is not about his love. Rather, he asks she takes his critiques as encouragements with, "I care, I want you to improve, that means." Yet, his comments seem to ignore the circumstances that Pema outlines in explaining that her lack of proficiency in Tibetan is not solely her fault. At the end of her video, Pema leverages phrases that express her identity. One of these reads, "British Tibetan." When I first saw this video in 2007, I remember being surprised at seeing the words British and Tibetan together because the Tibetan community was only beginning to grow in London at the time. It was the first time I had heard a Tibetan in Britain call themselves British Tibetan. Back then, she was also the only British Tibetan I knew. Pema, a Japanese Tibetan who speaks English mixed with Tibetan, cannot quite fit the ideal Tibetan image that her father proposes. Instead, she plays with that image by presenting herself in traditional Tibetan clothes in front of an image of the Tibetan landscape with prayer flags and a yak. In juxtaposition, she also presents herself wearing a hoodie and jeans in front of an image of the streets of London. Both self-representations express her identity. At the end of the video, Pema declares she is British Tibetan, choosing to define herself instead of letting others define her. Contrary to advocates of purity, Pema's redefinition of her identity as a British Tibetan allows her to embrace her Tibetan identity and history without compromising her personal history in London. Despite having been born and raised in Western spaces, Pema says that she tries her best to be a part of Tibet and the Tibetan community. For Pema, her efforts in being part of the Tibetan community is reflected in her choice to remain active in the Tibetan political movement. These are but some examples of how Tibetan youth in the West try to engage as well as meet the challenges of being Tibetan. Purity advocates ignore such efforts, focusing instead on the need for purity as avenues for ensuring Tibetan continuity. Why such disconnect? To get a better understanding, I turn to intergenerational history. The Chinese invasion forced large numbers of Tibetans to become refugees as a collective in Nepal and India. In response to the destabilizing conditions of having become refugees, Tibetans reconstituted life and community through the construction of refugee settlements and schools. John F. Avedon details this construction period in his book, In Exile from the Land of Snows. Avedon records an incident in the 1970s regarding an individual named Temba. Temba had escaped the Chinese invasion of Tibet with his parents in the 1960s. Following the deaths of Temba's mother and sister soon after their arrival in India, Demba's father places him in a Tibetan boarding school the Dalai Lama had founded. Following his high school graduation, Demba reunites with his father in a South India refugee settlement that his father had helped build. At this settlement, Demba says he was not the only young graduate rejoining his family, but there were others too like him. They enjoyed wearing bell-bottoms and listening and dancing to the Beatles. However, the adoption of such sensibilities was seen as negative by the older generation because these new habits and tastes ignited fears of cultural extinction. Demba remembers being reprimanded by his father and other elders. By the time Demba's father and his cohort began building refugee settlements in South India, they had already experienced a chain reaction of traumatic losses as a result of Tibet's invasion. As the Chinese destroyed traditional Tibetan institutions in Tibet, the Dalai Lama and his administration re-established Tibetan institutions and communities in exile for the preservation of the Tibetan culture. Cultural preservation thus became a vehicle through which Tibetans actualized projects of cultural continuity and peoplehood. Under such circumstances, Demba's father saw Demba's foreign sensibilities as deterrents that would hinder the project of cultural preservation in exile. In Kila Deal's ethnography, Echoes from Dharamsala, Deal also covers similar anxieties over cultural preservation that Avedon had recorded in the 1970s. In her ethnography of Tibetan musicians in the 1990s of Dharamsala, Tibetan elders were unsettled by the adoption of Chinese sensibilities in music and fashion by newcomers. Newcomers are recently arrived Tibetans in exile who had escaped China-colonized Tibet. The elders in Deal's ethnography were the same generation as Demba's father, and by the 1990s, they had become grandparents. Elders interpreted newcomers' linguistic abilities in Chinese and taste for Chinese music to be representative of the success of China's assimilation policies in Tibet. Similarly, elders saw the adoption of rock music by the Yak Band, who were represented as Tibetan youth born and raised in India, as negating efforts towards cultural preservation, despite efforts by both groups to sing songs with Tibetan lyrics. Since preservation was being conceptualized through the framework of developments taking place inside Tibet, any sensibilities considered foreign were being interpreted by the older generation as contaminants, deterring the project of cultural preservation. While they saw Chinese colonial policies inside Tibet as forceful interventions that sought to transform Tibetans into Chinese subjects, they saw the adoption of foreign sensibilities by exiled Tibetan youth as voluntary. It was the voluntary aspect of such adoptions that they critiqued most as obstacles for the project of cultural preservation. Such themes of fear surrounding cultural extinction traveled with Tibetans when they shifted to the West by the mid-1990s. In Hip Hop Gangster, or Most Deserving of Victims, Emily Ye and Gunga Lama uncover similar anxieties between the young and old in San Francisco during the early 2000s. While hip hop was becoming mainstream in the US, it was foreign to Tibetan parents who were born and raised as refugees in India or Nepal. Self-described Tibetan rappers rapped in English at community events about their marginalized, racialized experiences in which they were coded as Asian American immigrants, refugee Tibetans, and survivor victims of the Chinese invasion. And yet, Tibetan parents could make little sense of this chosen American medium. Overall, they conclude that elders viewed their children's adoption of hip-hop sensibilities as dilution of the Tibetan culture, and thus as threats to the overall project of cultural preservation. Although different notions of purity may have existed in Tibet prior to China's invasion, the post-invasion collective approach to purity by Tibetans from differing regions and backgrounds makes this current version new. It claims that Tibetan culture was pure before contamination from the Chinese invasion. As such, current conversations regarding purity have resulted from real Tibetan experiences with China's physical and cultural destruction of Tibet. Notions of purity should therefore be historically situated and contextualized. Purity conversations reveal that they are not only about negotiating the politics of belonging. Instead, they shed light on the persistence of traumatic historical memories and how such memories continue to produce and reproduce the Tibetan refugee community in diaspora. Doing the work of historicizing purity helps to contextualize why older generations of Tibetans born and raised in a free Tibet reacted in the way they did to Tempa and his generation's embrace of foreign taste in India during the 1970s. It also helps to explain how purity conversations resurface each time the Tibetan diaspora encounters a new exile. Current conversations on purity, for instance, coincide with Tibetan migration to the West, a new diaspora space for Tibetans in exile. Although it is essential to approach Tibetan concepts of purity historically, as cases from different decades demonstrate, purity politics narrow rather than broaden the politics of belonging for Tibetans of diverse backgrounds. Purity politics positions Tibetans who mix or are mixed in a polarizing framework that views them as becoming something else, something not Tibetan. But what does a pure Tibetan look or sound like? For purity advocates, a pure Tibetan is neither genetically mixed nor mixes Tibetan with any other languages. However, the Tibetan vernacular has always been mixed. Even the Tibetan alphabet is acknowledged by Tibetan historians as having been adopted from the Indian alphabet following Tibet's adoption of Buddhism from India in the 7th century. The Tibetan language is also diverse, with dialectical differences based on regions and villages that have changed over time. According to Tibetan history, Mongolians fought wars on behalf of different Tibetan religious patriarchs and have intermarried with Tibetans in different parts of Tibet. Neither genetically pure Tibetan nor a pure version of any spoken Tibetan dialect exists. Rather, Tibetans have always had a heterogeneous culture that acknowledges hybridity, a notion recognized in Tibetan origin story that suggests Tibetans were the result of the copulation between a compassionate monkey and a lustful rock ogress. Hybridity also makes room for recognizing Tibetan histories as diverse, continuous, and moving. Yet, the logic of purity demands that the project of cultural preservation be enacted in a manner that keeps Tibetan culture pure. Under such circumstances, certain Tibetan practices are forced to remain static and one-dimensional. Those who enact Tibetan subjectivities different from the prescribed notions are thus accused of mixing and of being inauthentic and impure. Rather than a view of Tibetan culture that is static, I propose a view of Tibetan culture as rooted and routed, a framework that views cultures as moving, evolving, and gesturing towards its past and its horizon. This depiction allows Tibetans of all backgrounds to be seen as subjects continuing to interact with changes resulting from the Chinese invasion without being assumed to have compromised their Tibetanness. This way of conceptualizing Tibetanness moves away from centering the Chinese invasion as the beginning of the end. Instead, it centers Tibetanness as rooted and routed. Under such circumstances, Tibetans enjoying the Beatles, rock and roll, Chinese pop, or American hip hop do not have to be thought of as having compromised their Tibetanness. Rather, for Tibetans singing in the style of rock and roll or hip hop about their current circumstances can be thought of as enacting their Tibetanness, a performance that is both residual and emergent. This framing embraces historical and contemporary multiplicities of Tibetan identities without forgetting Tibetan roots. The solution lies in aiming for authenticity without opposing hybridity. Hybridity and authenticity are not mutually exclusive, as some purists mistakenly think. A hybrid approach allows Tibetanness to be in conversation with what is old and new. Doing so allows Tibetan culture and identity to be seen as multiple and continuous, and in the process discourages static notions. Such an approach also ensures the futurity of Tibetan identities because it allows room for change that will continue to shape different subjectivities of Tibetans living under different conditions in different lands as displaced or colonized people without assuming they have compromised their Tibetanness. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. I think this paper bring out the issue is who is pure Tibetan. But the question is rather to answer who is pure Tibetans, rather we want to ask why we want to ask the question about who is a pure Tibetan and also for what purpose. I think that is a very important issue for this paper. Okay, so then we will go to the third paper. The topic is making a mediatized Tibetan refugee community in India. And a presenter is Professor Steve Basu, who is assistant professor from Central University of Gujarat. Please, Professor Basu.
I utterly grateful to National Cheng Kung University to have invited me here. It would have been good to be there, but I guess we have to make do with this. But I will try to encapsulate whatever I have been able to cover, and most of it, as it goes, is not a field-based work. It is mainly to do with how one has conceptualized the digital world into which we are all inhabiting in some ways, and the refugees are also inhabiting the same world. And having come into the digital world, the Tibetan exile realities are now very different, because now increasingly we find that the Tibetans are torn between nostalgia, restraint, aspirations, life chances, and all these kinds of difficulties of choices and dilemmas. And we do find the mass media abundance, which has also resulted in, as we say, the proliferation of voices. And at the same time, we find a difference in the way Tibetans are communicating with their counterparts in other cultures, as well as within their communities. So this paper is trying to also understand the communicative discourses within a vibrant media interactive space that lay Tibetans are increasingly inhabiting in this world, and the kind of opportunities and the hazards that this kind of reality has thrown up. So one kind of this thing is, as we know, that the digital world has provided this opportunity for the Tibetans and likewise other counterparts as well to express themselves, to express their beings in exile, and a different way of making sense of one's past, and also a method by which using the interactive media space to preserve whatever is getting threatened physically. So the virtual Tibet, or what I've also mentioned on Tibet Online, also helps us to move away from what for a long time, both in colonial discourses, has been termed as the exoticized Shangri-La image, which talks about a pristine, which had always talked about a pristine Tibet, but no longer so. Increasingly, we find that the media images beamed, is showing a Tibet which is traumatized, violated, and degraded. I mean, it's also degraded in terms of its physicality, its environment. And many of it is also coming from not just the digital world. It is also coming from the newly arrived refugees who are coming into Tibet, into India, and who are also using their media facility to actually make their presence felt. So they are also embodying whatever is going on in Tibet, both in terms of physical interaction, face to face, but many of these newly arrived refugees who are coming into India are also using their experiences and disseminating it in the media spaces. But at the same time, and if you can come to the next slide, the other one, the slide after this. Yeah. So we also here have to acknowledge the fact that since 2003, although we find that there has been the increasing use of the digital space, but at the same time, the state, the overwhelming presence of the Chinese state has used a massive digital security apparatus since 2003, which of course has increased manifold after the Olympic Games in 2008. And the fallout of this digital technology has been, the effect that it has had on the Tibetan subjectivity is something that I would want to expand on. Next slide, please. Yes, yes. Okay, now the effect that the subjective effects that the digital technologies have had on the Tibetan mental scape is one where we have to also take into account the fact that because of this increasing traffic on the internet, we find on the one hand that Tibetans have been able to, as I said earlier, restore a certain kind of sense of being, which comes because they have been able to express their longing, their despair, their overcoming, and their forbearance in exile. And of course, also those who are living in Tibet, who are also able to express their angst. But what is also produced out of the online interactions, and many of this is available on the internet, is the diversity of voices and alternative virtual spaces that are coming out of the internet arena. One which in some senses challenges the Dharamshala discourse on nationalism, which intends to actually subvert the Chinese state's version of citizenship. There are also disagreements that we find coming out of many of the goals and tactics that the Tibetans have or are desired to adopt vis-a-vis the Chinese state. And many of these controversies are something which we also find where certain blogs that we come across, the famous one is the High Peaks in Pure Earth, which in some senses gives an ontological security to Tibetans, and which this security comes from the fact that it's a medium through which Tibetans have freely expressed the kind of human rights violations that are happening in Tibet. But at the same time, the contrasting aspect of this use of digital technology is that in a blog such as the Songs Inside Tibetans' Hearts, which in some senses also presents what I've mentioned here as the enthralling imagery of Tibet. So what the online medium is resulting in is that it is sometimes also resulting in the museumizing of the ethnicity that is Tibetan. It is also monumentalizing the rich cultural heritage of Tibet. And it is also for what I've said is a consumerist consumption, which is part of the way in which this entire body of traffic within the digital space is getting commodified in certain ways. But at the same time, this commodification has not, in some senses, halted the kind of agency that the Tibetans have suddenly found themselves having. And in some senses, this kind of interaction on the internet has enabled Chinese laypersons to become a little more sensitive towards the Tibetan predicament. Also, although I would say that the numbers are in some senses limited. We also find, and this is another very interesting effect, is the way in which certain acts of self-immolation, and we find it increasingly possible, and this is made possible because of the internet, is how these self-immolations are caught on camera and posted on websites. And it has had a dramatic visibility effect and effects. And it therefore calls for attention to atrocities committed against Tibetans. And in some senses, it's not only the dispersion of images, but it is also a call to others who are also, in some senses, in similar subjective and objective positions of repression, to connect emotionally, effectively, to this kind of self-sacrifice. So it's a kind of sacrifice that is dramatized and called attention to. Now, what happens when these images are increasingly circulated? Now, there is a certain kind of solidarity effect that the Tibetan cause has. And this solidarity effect is something that I would like to pose and in fact also probe. And the possibility that the Tibetan, that the internet and the digital world affords in allowing for the possibility of solidarity. Now, what the digital technology effect has on the Tibetan diaspora is the conveying of a certain sadness and disillusionment. Now, this sadness and disillusionment is also conveyed through what in a very good work by Hedi Swank, in which she uses what she has termed as anti-language, in which it's a certain use of poetic and linguistic skills through which the Tibetans are able to also, and here it's mainly the newly arrived Tibetans who are able to convey a certain sense of otherness, even among the Tibetan refugee community. So there are, in fact, this feeling of sadness which is getting the Tibetans are sort of realizing that it is not just the other, is just not the non-Tibetan, but the other could also be Tibetans living within their own particular community who are facing a different kind of an exile situation. Now, this whole effect of using the internet has also resulted in what we can call as a generalized sense of unbelonging. Because after all, we also realize that the effect of a digital technology is that it also creates a certain kind of separateness, that it also creates a certain kinds of distancing that the Tibetans, or for that matter, any other user, would not be able to take control of. Then this distancing and this unbelonging can also, in a way, affect the possibility of what the Tibetans would say a preservation of unity in the context of increasing fragmentation and divisiveness that we find not only in the diaspora, but this divisiveness and fragmentation is also visible in the media spaces that Tibetans are inhabiting. So in some senses, the media spaces do not always allow for the coming together and a solidarity effect that one would wish for. But sometimes these solidarities may not actually happen, because we do find that Tibetans who are in a position of vulnerability may not be in a position to ally with or be keen to have solidarity alliances with other communities who are in a similar position of vulnerability for various political, social, and economic constraints. So the media space as such cannot deterministically produce the solidarity effect that that one would wish for. And therefore, as I said, the possibility of horizontal alliances across spaces with other oppressed communities is something that is not a given. It is something that is part of this ongoing struggle. So the creation of what one can call a transnational discursive public space for articulations through the media world is something that is an ongoing, emergent phenomena. And we really are not in a position to come to a certain kind of a conclusion about what kind of an effect that would have on the ground with regard to the formation of social solidarities, or for that matter, the creation of new kinds of social movements that would enable Tibetans and their counterparts, people having other oppressed groups, to emancipate their lives. Some of the concluding remarks. Whatever be the contrasting effects of the digital, these cyberspaces, for the time being, has actually also allowed Tibetans who are disparately situated to access the religious world and the religious world that they have left behind in Tibet. And some of the charismatic reincarnated lamas are the ones with whom the lay Tibetans are conversing. They also have now access to sacred rituals and texts, and they have also members who are they are also able to trace their origins to specific places and regions in Tibet, and at least visually have a certain kind of an impression of what is going on. What the effect of the digital technology I have perceived in some ways is that it has allowed for a certain portable idea of nationalism to emerge. And it has also given a possibility to Tibetans to enact and have different versions of their selves. And these selves are not only situated historically and geographically, but these versions of the Tibetan selves are also being conveyed differently in the media spaces. But what we have to actually be very clear about is the whole politics and the ethics of reportage, how things are actually being reported in cyberspaces. And there's this whole question of the authenticity of information in cyberspace, simply because we are very well aware of the kind of debilitating and deleterious effects of fake news that is found abundant in media spaces. So if one has to counter this, one has to have and devise a certain kind of a methodology that would allow for Tibetans who want to access credible and authentic information to come to them, so that they can successfully adopt a credible self-definitions about not only who they are, but about the situation in Tibet. And many of these, cyberspaces are allowing for debates to happen online. And these debates are also on what constitutes not just their condition in exile, but debates on modern day Buddhism. And there are also debates taking place on the future of Tibet, the role of the Dalai Lama, what would happen once the Dalai Lama is no more. And these kinds of debates are something which can be questioned with regard to its authenticity. But we cannot discount the fact that if we take these debates together, they give a certain picture of the emergent Tibetan digital self, or what we can call a new kind of Tibetan subjecthood, which is emerging in exile. And at the same time, there is also a sense of how the media space is helping Tibetans to come to terms with the notion of sacrifice, the notion of loss. Because in some senses, the media space can give an illusion of overcompensation. In some senses, the media space, as we know, can give an illusion of solidarity. But these illusions are something that has to be subtracted from what exactly is going on the ground. And therefore, even if Tibetans and their counterparts of those who are oppressed in other communities, how far they are connected to each other will be highly, in some senses, will be very important in order to be able to come to a certain understanding about how the refugees can take their situation forward into a world which is more emancipated in some ways. So it is necessary that the media be used as a good handle to find new anchors, to enable the Tibetan refugees to also find new networks in distant lands. But this network and anchors that are afforded through the media space should also enable the Tibetans to develop a certain kind of imagining about who they are and about where they are. But this imagining about who they are and where they are has to be grounded in the realities that the world around them is throwing at the Tibetans, right? So I think I would end here, and I think this is about it. Yes. If there is anything, then I can take questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sudip Basu's presentation. I think now we have a virtual Tibet in cyberspace, and that cyberspace is still a contested terrain because we have many agencies, many actors, and people from different locations, of course, have different ideology and ideas. So I think your paper has helped us to understand another part of Tibet, and it's still very complicated, and still lots of dimensions on it. I definitely, this should be a new issue to be studied further. Thank you so much. So now, thanks for the presenters of this panel. And although these 3 papers talking on different subjects, but still also has the commonality on Tibetan society in exile with different aspects by different generations, and inside and outside Tibet. And so there are lots of differences. And this kind of situation is quite different what we have understand Tibetan society in exile. Before, it has presented a very unified picture situation to outside. And Tibetan society tried to let people understand they are just one Tibetan society, and everyone are unified for the Tibetan cause. But still, there are many groups, categories within the Tibetan society. So, of course, people has different opinions. So that's the current situation now. I think so. All these 3 people, all 3 papers are very updated situation of Tibetan community in exile now. So now we have, I think we have questions from Slido, and okay, we have 2 questions in Slido, and one question is on is from Tawa Loki-san for Dr. Basu. So let's see. So okay, I will start from the question from Slido for Tawa. Is Tawa, how do you two place the discourse about Tibetan diaspora identity with conceptual discussion about diaspora that shifted from being nationalist oriented toward the ideal of hybrid identity? So then the next question, I think is also to Tawa, so you can answer together. The second question is, Tawa, given that about 50% of Tibetan diaspora located outside India and the number seems to be growing. With such a shift, how do you see identity politics unfolding within Exile community? So, so we will let Tawa to answer the question first.
Thank you for this, the insightful questions. I actually don't think that it's actually either about nationalism or the movement for identity. What I do is actually historicize these conversations, and what you find out from these, the historical avenue through which I've engaged this question is first, I mean, I asked who is a pure Tibetan. It's not a question that I ask. It's a question that Tibetan elders have asked, but also scholars. So I engaged 3 different scholarship in different eras, one from the 70s, the other from the 90s, and then the most recent from the 2000s. And what I thought was interesting is what our co-host has already kind of commented right after my essay, is that, you know, why the question, who is a pure Tibetan? To me, the question really began for the Tibetan community as it's a question that coincides with the invasion. And what I talk about is that the purity question isn't actually about just the politics of belonging, but about actual lived experiences that Denpa's father, for example, Tibetans who experienced invasion, Tibetans who continue to experience infrastructural degradation. I mean, like the development stuff right now in Tibet. So Tibetans continue to experience the degradation of their culture, their landscape inside Tibet. And in many ways, Tibetans in diaspora, including Tibetans who are colonized and in diaspora, reacting to this through the project of cultural preservation. On the one hand, you see the Chinese destroying everything, and on the other hand, Tibetans responding to this destruction with their own preservation projects. And through these avenues, you get these questions coming up. The other thing I wanted to focus on was this question comes up every time Tibetans are experiencing a new form of exile. The last example I showed was in the West in the 2000s. The Tibetan diaspora community started moving to the West in the early 90s. And now, as the second question points out, like 50% of the Tibetan diaspora now live outside of Asia. They're living in the West. So the question of cultural preservation comes up again, just like it did for the first generation who came to exile. How were they going to actualize cultural preservation while being removed from Tibet? So the question of identity is closely tied to the experience of colonial violence and the need for nationalist identity formation. These are responses to destruction that Tibetans are experiencing inside Tibet that have to do with colonial violence.
Okay, I think we need to wait for Tawa to connect again. So before we are waiting for Tawa, actually, are there any questions from the audience, online audience? You can use Slido or you can type. But if not, actually, I have some questions. I have one question for Digi. Actually, you mentioned about many young Tibetans are trying to get Indian citizenship. And I know this is quite a personal choices for their own future. But when there are many people have the same choice. So what it will happen collectively for the Tibetan society in the future? For example, the CTA government needs people. So if all the people now is under CTA become Indian citizenship, what kind of situation will happen? And how the Tibetan community discussed about this issue? So this is my question. So Digi, could you answer?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you repeat the question?
My question?
Yes, can you
Okay.
repeat?
Okay. I repeat my question again is what happened to the CTA? Can you understand? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, what happened to the CTA if the Tibetan younger generation chose to be Indian citizenship? So although it is a personal choice, but then it will become a collective influences. So how do the Tibetan community discuss this kind of situation? The impact on the future of CTA.
I don't know whether I'll be the right person to answer this, but from my own assumption or from my observation, there are two sections of Tibetans who want Indian citizenship, and there are other section of Tibetans who does not want Indian citizenship. So the chances of every Tibetan becoming Indian citizenship will be, I think, for now I can say it's not. It's impossible to have all the young Tibetans having, but the problem here is not just about the young Tibetans becoming Indian citizens. The concern is young Tibetan movement towards to the Western country. That is more concern for now. So, in my opinion, I don't think every Tibetan would want to take Indian citizenship. So the sustainability of CTA in the future, I can assure that the sustainability of CTA will be there in the future, but the number of people living in the settlement might decrease. So this is how I can say from my own observation during the interview with my participant.
Okay. Thank you so much. Because, yeah, I think that the other issue is all the young people move out
Yes.
India. I think this is not a serious issue to be concerned. Okay.
Because during
Yes.
the interview, there are certain section who would want Indian citizenship. There are other section of young Tibetans who does not want to claim citizenship and would want to remain as a refugee. So they to say say the sustainability of refugee in the future is there, but the number will be much lesser from now. Yeah.
But either way, the consequence will be the same, right?
Yes.
Will have a huge impact on the CTA in India because you still need the people. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. This is the question is still to be.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Discussed. Okay. Could we get Dawa back? Is that possible? So before Dawa back, actually, I have one question for Professor Astrid Basu. Okay. What kind of language are all these Tibetans communicate to each other on the cyberspace? Are they using Tibetan, English, or Chinese? I think I'm very curious about what the language they are used. Might be something very interesting to observe. So this is just out of my curiosity. Yeah.
No, in fact, a lot of my research, in some senses, this is an ongoing work, as you can also make out. in the sense that it's such a space that needs to be decoded, and we have to really understand language is very, very critical to decode, particularly the kind of language being used in cyberspace. And in some senses, it's very homogeneous because we find that people from all kinds of oppressed communities, perhaps, and this requires a new kind of research, whether the kind of language which is being used, whether it's similar across communities located in different places. But the kind of language which is used by Tibetans particularly in India, it's remarkably similar to some extent to the ordinary Indians using their particular kind of language. Where this is what the internet does. It also homogenizes. And we find that it is the language which can be conveyed in usually, I mean, the facility of whether they use, and Tibetans, of course, used. So is English. I would also want, and I've still to find whether Tibetans living in Karnataka in India are using Kannada or not. And I would want, the kind of diversity that is possible. And perhaps Tibetans living in parts of Europe could be using German or not. And I think I still can't really, answer that part because I have not done research in these areas. But it calls for attention. And I take your question very seriously in terms of how we can really understand refugee language itself on cyberspace. So in some senses, it could be a combination of a socio-linguistic study combined with content analysis, and also just to see the kind of symbolism that is attached to these languages. And one has to be also guarded about the authenticity of the use of this language, which I actually pointed out when I was making my presentation.
Okay, thank you so much. I think there is one more question for Dr. Basu.
Yes.
Can the Tibetans inside and outside Tibet be connected through the cyberspace or by digital means? Yeah.
See, the use of the internet space was much greater at the turn of the century, where the facility was immediately given, and the state was not prepared to actually filter out that bit of information which they felt was threatening. So the clampdown and the use of surveillance took place after 2008. So in some ways, even the interaction on the digital space is not it's not unbounded in any ways. There are all kinds of restrictions that have been put in place, but somewhere at least the connect with what is happening on the ground and the way information on the ground is being filtered into the cyberspace is what one has to look out for. And I think a lot of research requires to be done where families are, even though they are able to connect with their counterparts in the diaspora, families in Tibet are able to connect with their counterparts in diaspora, whether it is really helping whether this exchange, although it is very limited, whether it's helping in a certain kind of, or a feeling of security, a feeling of attachment, of even unbelonging, all these things have to be, sort of researched upon, because it's so difficult really to understand the effect of the digital space on subjectivities. And even though in my presentation, I was trying to make a subjective assessment of the presence of the digital technology, but even this assessment has been in some senses very objective, because it is still very difficult to find out what effect it is actually having on the minds of people.
Okay, I think here is actually another question from Dawa to Dr. Basu. But
Yeah.
Dawa, are you online?
I am. I'm on video.
Okay, okay. Could you ask the question by yourself to Dr. Basu? I think
The thing
you
is,
wrote
I
down
got
something.
disconnected. I got disconnected and I can't
Yes.
see the last chat. But what
Okay.
I
Okay.
just wanted to quickly say that my master's was entirely on the digital space in transnational Tibetan refugee community. And a lot of my research is based in the Tibetan community and the conversations that travel transnationally. I think what's interesting about the digital space is not that it creates new conversations, it actually amplifies existing ones. So I was kind of confused. I was like wondering if Dr. Basu's findings were entirely based off of the internet as a space for these conversations emerging, or are you saying that they are existing conversations that become amplified on the internet? Because to me, the two are intimately tied.
Right. No, it's
I also run Hakar Diaries, the blog. So I also see a lot of digital interaction through that avenue, and it's been running for the last 11 years.
I think your point about the debates already being there and it getting amplified is well taken. And I would go by the latter. Because already these debates have been there in texts and been there in the physical world where people are interacting face to face. But what the digital world would have, and it's increasingly doing now, is that on the one hand, it may be amplifying, but in the process of amplification, what kind of distortions and deceptions and misrepresentations are taking place is something that needs to be probed. And I think further research could be done on this. And is it resulting in a heightened belonging, or is it sort of also resulting in a heightened unbelonging? Because these conversations are also done very casually. There is a certain kind of distancing that takes place when such conversations are made. These are not, in some senses, as we know, serious conversations. Although it can be serious sometimes, but these are also lay conversations on matters related to environmental degradation, the role of the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan, the conversations on the elections that recently happened. Now, what these kinds of media interaction does is that it makes this whole notion of nationalism portable, available, but this availability and portability of it, in fact, dumbs down the debate in some ways. And it's not just about the Tibetan this thing itself. I mean, it's actually happening across the populations. So in one sense, amplification, yes, but it could, as a result of this amplification, the social effect that it has is that it can actually also result in a lot of divisiveness. And
yeah, but it seems to be more about questions. Like, I think like here, this seems to be a larger kind of a broader conversations about like what the transnational digital space can mean. But it also seems to be about what kind of questions as a researcher do you have? Who's having these discussions? What kind of topics are they talking about? who are these topics targeting? I think what's interesting is I actually engaged, the paper that I actually submitted was on gender and leadership in the exiled Tibetan community. And I look at a specific amplification of certain kinds of gender discourses taking place within the Tibetan community transnationally, and how that impacted how CTA would approach gender as a policy within the structure of the government. So in many ways, it is about like, what are the discussions? Who are the discussions targeting? What are the impacts? What are the impacts that it's having? And I thought what was interesting about a lot of gender discussions that were happening transnationally within the Tibetan community, it wasn't really targeting China at the time. It was targeting specifically CTA. And in many ways, they got CTA to act on a lot of gendered issues that they were having. So I think the question is really about the transnational, like digital space as being a medium rather than the deterrent of these kinds of discussions. And on the other hand, it almost seems like you're also talking about the securitization of digital space in the last like era. On the one hand, you have international communication happening on the internet, but on the other hand, you have security clampdowns also happening. So it seems to me like you're having a discussion about that, but also you're having a discussion about larger transnational Tibetan community conversations on politics. And as far as divisiveness is concerned, in terms of different kinds of politics being exposed to the larger community and having discussions on these topics. So I understand what you're saying, but I also think that it's really important to have a concrete specificity about who you're talking about, what you're talking about, and how, like, who are these conversations targeting and what are the effects?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the discussion. I wish there one more question. So let's go to Digi. What is your understanding about the new regulation that exile government imposed? Like if you seek Indian citizen, one has to leave the settlement. So Digi, could you
Yes.
have a short answer of this question?
Yes, I've answered in the chat also.
Okay. Could you just explain in oral?
Some of Tibetan Indian who has Indian citizenship still lives in the settlement without any problem.
Without any
So,
problem.
yeah,
Okay.
so far they haven't implemented it yet.
Okay.
So maybe in the future, so we never know. So far they haven't implemented yet. And this
Okay.
was not from CTA, it was from Indian government.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that is
So
my
which
answer for that question.
so which means in the future, if a Tibetan get an Indian citizenship, one has to leave the settlement, Tibetan settlement, because he or
Yeah,
she
as
will
yeah,
not
as
be
per
a
the
refugee,
regulation,
right?
yes, as per the regulation, those who have claimed Indian citizenship are not eligible or not entitled to have a refugee the refugee facilities. So those who take Indian citizenship cannot avail all the refugee rights that is entitled only for the refugees. So as per the regulation, this was the rule that they have made it, but they haven't implemented yet so far.
Okay.
So
Okay.
those Tibetan who stays in the settlement enjoys both Indian citizen right and refugee rights.
Yeah, but in the future, this kind of situation might
Yes,
be
that's it.
changed. Maybe sooner or later, who knows, right?
Yeah, this
Okay.
might trouble them in the future, so we cannot say anything for now.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Okay, I think now it's 2:30, and I think we have
Yes.
quite a fully discussion of in this panel, and I think
I
this
had
is
just
okay.
one question. Can I?
Okay, so be short because okay, please.
I mean, I had just typed that question down. There
Okay.
was to Dawa Lokchi-san.
Oh, okay. Where?
If she wants, she can. I can also.
Okay, please. So you have question for
Yeah.
Dawa?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just one question,
Okay.
if that
Okay.
could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Just please.
Yeah. The one point that I sort of, after hearing the presentation, since you have talked about Tibetans in the West and the question of purity, why, in your assessment, has there not been the construction of an Indian Tibetan? In the sense, although the Tibetans are seeking Indian citizenship, but that is happening at the political sphere. But how about, the category of an Indian Tibetan, which, if I can call that within a private sphere? Or do you think that India still is in the background for Tibetans, that India is still not a space that is lived through the purity and the impurity axis that you have come up with, unlike, say, in the West?
Okay, please.
There's actually a lot of scholarship in the 90s. Tim Lau wrote about the embrace of Indian identity within Tibetan communities. So if you're interested, you could look at that. I actually think this question is more geared towards Diki because that's her research. But there are Tibetans who identify as Indian Tibetan. And as she has said, there are young Tibetans who want an Indian citizenship and align with India culturally. And then there are young Tibetans who don't want that either because their politics of refusal align towards a sovereign Tibet. So my advisor, Dr. Carol McGranahan, has written an article called Refusal and Gift of Citizenship, actually historicizes refusing citizenship for 2 generations and why. And then why the younger generation seems to be prone more towards accepting it. I think it really is about the prolonging of exile. I think the first 2 generations thought that the Tibet issue would be resolved and they'd be able to return. And I think what you have now is prolonging of exile and the problem of marginalization as refugees. So, but if you want to talk more about, culturally, whether Tibetans accept Indian culture and et cetera, you could just look at Tibetans embracing Bollywood, for example. So I don't necessarily think it's a question of whether they integrate or assimilate. I think this is about political choices that is tied to the development of what's going on inside Tibet. And I think, as I have expressed in my presentation, it is really important to situate these questions in the context of colonial violence and colonial occupation and the continuation of Tibet's occupation. All of these become extremely important for how Tibetans negotiate these questions. They're not separate. And I'm saying we must actually engage these questions historically. You can't just place them. I don't think it's fair to ask Tibetans whether they accept one culture over the other. I actually think asking why Tibetans are in exile in the first place will answer half of those questions. I'm also trying to emphasize that it's not just these pure Tibetan advocates, it's also researchers who place the degradation of Tibetan culture as if it's an individual choice. It's not. We are collectively in exile for reasons. And those reasons should be applied to how we conceptualize these questions and reactions. As researchers, we must ask better and more open questions. And I think it must be historical.
Okay, thank you so much. I think if we have time, we can have the conversation longer, but since we have a next panel, and today I think we have a very wonderful and a very fruitful panel, and thank you the 3 presenters, and thanks for the audience, and we hope we can have opportunity to see each other face to face and then to discuss this issue again. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.